Alright, this is my first screencast, and it's going to be about unemployment. So we're combining modules 13, 14, and 15. In general, we're looking to classify unemployment, looking at the idea of natural unemployment, exactly what does that mean, look at how inflation is calculated, and talk about the dangers of inflation, or why unstable inflation is costly. And here's a look at some of the best known and most interesting blogs relating to economics, and also down on the bottom you can see the BLS and the BEA are macroeconomic data from the government. Alright, so the question here that we'll be playing with for the rest of the quarter is, which is a higher danger for the economy? Inflation bouncing around or unemployment rising? And if you've got the uncomfortable situation of both at the same time, which would be your first policy objective? And our intent in this chapter is just to introduce the idea and talk about how they're measured. So we've seen this type of graph before, where we're looking at the purple shaded vertical lines as recessions, and we notice that unemployment always rises during recessions, and not always, but usually falls during periods of economic expansion, if not at first, then eventually as the expansion takes off. And we'll look at unemployment first. We've covered already the calculation of unemployment, but here's just a little bit of a review there. The Census Bureau is the one that calculates unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is one of several measures that economists use and that are reported in the news to get a fuller picture of what's going on employment-wise in the U.S. So this is not the only measure, but it is one of the most important measures. So how is it done? The Census Bureau calls 60,000 households every month, and the BLS has determined the questions that will be asked, and from that we determine unemployment. This slide is just review, so it's a look at unemployment rate being different than labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is a look at how many people in the adult population are actually looking for a job or have a job. And then the unemployment rate out of the labor force, so not the full population, what percent of people are actively, that is in the last 4 weeks, looking for work. So here's the first of some optional quiz questions. You can pause it here and consider the question. The answers are given at the end. Alright, so the unemployment rate, again, you can pause it here on this slide, just some review of terms that we've already had. And here's some weaknesses with the unemployment rate. And here's your definitions of discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, and underemployed workers, which are important because they're all sort of hidden inside the labor force, the unemployment statistics. Here's another quiz question for you. You can pause it here and answer. And another quiz question. Alright, so moving into the idea of the natural rate of unemployment. It's clear that an economy can't really have an unemployment rate of 0.0%. In fact, over the past 50 years, it's never dropped below 2.9%. So what gives? Well, there's one type of unemployment that's the worst in terms of its effect, a devastating effect on the economy during recessions, and that's cyclical unemployment, your last one. The first two are types of unemployment that we expect to see even in good years. So even in good years, there's frictional and there's structural unemployment. So what's the difference between frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment? Well, let's start with frictional. Frictional is the type of unemployment that is the natural workings of a labor market not being perfectly able to instantly align talent with need. So lack of information, the search time for getting your new job, that takes a while. So for instance, it takes a while for this person to realize their true calling. Let's put this guy Here we assume maybe he looks more like he belongs there, but again, this may happen over time. He may try this job before he tries this job. He may work for a boss that he doesn't get along with, and there may be some friction there. There's also maybe some friction as you get ready to graduate and are looking for your first job. It takes a little while to find, hopefully not too long, but takes a little while to find your right spot. Frictional unemployment is generally small and smaller with the advent of technologies like job search websites, etc., and headhunters. And it's usually a good kind of unemployment. It means, for the most part, that people are looking for and finding better jobs. And it's important to take the time to do that. So here's a look at a pie chart from 2007, before the financial crisis and things got really weird. So we'll treat this as a good year. Most people were unemployed for a fairly short time, less than 5 weeks or 5 to 14 weeks. So that's what we hope and expect, that most people are not out of work for a very long time, where their skills can atrophy and they can be less hireable. The second type of unemployment we'll call structural unemployment, and that has to do with changing structure in the labor force. So this takes a little bit of time to explain, so let's jump in. So if there are, in a particular labor market, let's say the high-tech software industry, if there are more people able and willing to work in a particular area in that industry than there are jobs at that given wage, and there's not an overall recession where we're seeing unemployment widespread across various industries, then what you probably have on your hands is structural unemployment. Some of the causes that we can point at, and I would add to this free trade and some technological change, but basically if people are displaced and unable to work, not because there's an overall shortage of jobs, but because the pay, there's too many of them, the supply of labor is too high compared to the demand for labor, the people that are hiring the workers. So sometimes when labor unions are strong, they're not so strong in the U.S. anymore, so this doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. But if you had a strong labor union that pushed the wage far above its otherwise equilibrium level, you might experience some unemployment as firms decided to hire fewer workers, maybe produce less or substitute machines for workers. There's theories about efficiency wages. This is a fun little term that is the practice of employers setting the wage above the equilibrium. And this happens more in good economic times as an incentive to hold on to good employees for better performance, etc. But the reality is, when you know that there's higher than normal wages in, let's say, the software industry, a lot of people will be drawn to work in the software industry, and that's going to create a surplus of workers, or unemployment, and we would call it structural unemployment. Again, there's jobs, overall number of jobs is enough for the number of workers in the U.S., but they're not in this particular industry. The structure of this industry is off. In Europe, it's high levels, more generous unemployment insurance are thought to cause the higher unemployment rates that Europe has compared to the U.S. And then finally, mismatches between employees and employers. In geography, the software engineers aren't in the right state, or there's been a lot of talk about this since the financial crisis. Perhaps some of our problems result from mismatches of skills. We're not in the right majors in college for the demand for workers. In other words, we're simply not training our young people for the jobs in the modern economy. And if you're interested in unions, you'll need to look further than the treatment that this book gives. But unions are many different types of unions, and many different types of methodology that they seek to improve the well-being of their constituents. The union movement in the U.S. is weakened considerably over the last 30 to 40 years, especially compared to other countries. And here's a graph asking the question, are higher than average unemployment rates in Europe a result of perhaps more generous unemployment benefits? OECD would be the average of these rich countries, and so you can see some of the big European economies have higher than average unemployment for the decade 2000 to 2010. Meanwhile, the U.S. over here is below average. Here's another optional quiz question. Here's a look at how difficult it is to change employment law. The two pictures look eerily similar, but they are riots from different sides of the employment fence. Unemployed teens want France to adopt at-will employment to make it easier for firms to hire and fire over here in 2005. And then, as France proposed the changes, the employed teens, worried about losing their jobs for the new laws that would make it easier to fire, rioted. So we're almost to our definition of natural rate of unemployment. So if we agree that frictional and structural unemployment are always there, then we can start calling them naturally present or natural unemployment. So the natural rate of unemployment, as long as we have a good idea what our frictional and structural unemployment rates are, we can just add them together and voila, we've got our natural rate of unemployment. However, sometimes we're above our natural unemployment rate. This would be during a recession. During hard times, we expect the unemployment rate to rise, and that's because of this additional unemployment that is present during hard times. We'll call it cyclical unemployment, or unemployment due strictly to the business cycle's movements. So you can think of unemployment that arrives from recession. Here's a look at the Great Depression as the type of unemployment that we're talking about when we mean cyclical. The economy simply isn't creating enough jobs for all of its working age people that want jobs and need jobs. So it's probably obvious that we're going to want to estimate the natural rate of unemployment so we know how we're doing compared to our historic averages, and we know what kind of policy needs to be implemented, if any. So the natural rate of unemployment is the focus of quite a bit of economic analysis. The estimates are important, but they change over time, and they change because more women enter the labor force. We can get changing demographics. They'll change because we've got more or less unions. We've got temp agencies on the rise. We've got new disruptive technology that is helping certain workers be more productive and is replacing other workers. And then government policies for job training, for unemployment insurance, etc. Those can also change. And if any of those factors changes, it's clear that the natural rate of unemployment is going to change as well. And it's probably true that over time, as the percent of young workers declines, you get more experience. Your average worker is older. Plus, women are no longer new entrants. They've been trained in the workforce now for decades. So probably on average today, we've got more skill in the workforce than we had in 1960 or 1970, for instance. Here's another quiz question for you. And now we turn our attention to inflation rate. So the inflation rate, so often cited in the media and so often misunderstood, is simply a attempt to look at what's happening with overall or aggregate prices from year to year in the U.S. And with it, we compare the cost of living. We compare are wages rising or not, considering that prices are probably also rising. So the inflation rate is very important, especially since things like Social Security payments and other payments, certain wages are indexed or tied to the inflation rate. So how do we calculate the inflation rate? It's just the yearly percent change in a price index. The price index that's most often used here is the one that matters most to consumers, so it doesn't include every single price in the U.S. Because not all prices are equally important to your average family. So the Consumer Price Index, which is a subset of the prices in the U.S., the ones most important to families, and it's our most often used idea or measure of average prices. So we compare year over year the consumer price index, and we'll get the inflation rate if we take the, choose my pen here, if we take the percent change in the consumer price index from one year to the next. Inflation is an annual measure, so we take inflation to be the consumer price index in year 2 minus the consumer price index in year 1. And then we divide that by the consumer price index in year 1, our base. Take that whole thing and multiply it by 100, and that will give you a number like 3.9% inflation. And then, more interesting than the calculation is, what do we do with that number? Is 3.9% a good number for our economy? Is it a bad number? It's all going to depend. But generally we can conjure up ideas that super high inflation is bad, hyperinflation, rapid increases in prices, we're talking thousands, millions, billions, trillions of percent. These are German children with worthless German currency. So much was printed that it, in the interwar period, was pretty much useless. But that's not the situation that most countries have most of the time. So why do we worry about inflation? Is it the same type of worry? Are we worried about imminent hyperinflation and losing trust in the usability of our currency? No. And a quick look and reminder about the difference between real and nominal measures helps us realize that the level of prices doesn't really matter. Rather, it's the rate of increase. We'll want to remember that real in this class means adjusted for inflation. So for instance, if you've got a wage rate of $10 an hour and that moves up to $11 an hour, you've got basically a 10% increase in your nominal wage, but if prices have risen by 10% as well, then your real wage is unchanged. And we can take similar measures with real income, real GDP, real interest rates. We can adjust any of those measures for the impact of increased prices. And we'll see that as prices increase in an economy over time, usually wages, nominal wages that is, wages not adjusted for inflation, rise also. So at the end of the day, when you take into account real wage, that's unchanged. So as prices go up, nominal wages go up. You went from $10 to $11 an hour, but prices also rose by 10%. You're not any better or worse off. So here's a look at the price level in teal and the inflation rate. So the price level would be your CPI, and that's measured on the leftmost axis. This is one of those graphs that has a double axis. So on the right, because these are similar measures, we can plot them both on the same curve. On the right, it's the inflation rate. So on the left, you can see the teal line is increasing pretty much constantly throughout the time period under analysis, but you can see the purple line, the percent change in the average price are all over the place. Particularly, you can see some radical swings in the 70s, and then that slowed down, and we can see in the most recent recession here some actual negative inflation rate or deflation. So how are we to feel about unstable inflation? Is it better or worse than more constant inflation? Well, whenever inflation begins to heat up, there are some costs imposed by that inflation. One of the clearest costs here is the shoe leather cost, named because you wear out the leather on your shoes by running back and forth to the bank as you're trying not to hold money for too long, right? Because at every minute that you're holding money and prices are rising, your money is losing its value. And there are some other more obvious costs of inflation. For instance, if you're a restaurant owner, it's going to be a big hassle to reprint your menus every time prices change. There's evidence in history of, for instance, the Israeli examples, where restaurants and other establishments would come up with very creative ways to keep on top of the rapidly increasing prices. But it's difficult and costly. And of course, it's time you're not spending cooking enchiladas. or otherwise producing real goods and services. And finally, unit of account costs. So if money loses its ability to tell a story, if prices are bouncing around so much that money and prices are less reliable, then calculations and, frankly, future decisions are much harder for everybody, especially producers. And considering that prices don't always rise evenly, it can be confusing to know what is really getting more expensive compared to other things. So the thing that really riles economists about inflation is that some people will win and some people will lose arbitrarily from inflation. For instance, those that lend money at 5% interest rate, and then the inflation rate bumps up to 20% during the period where the money is being lent out, those lenders are going to lose. So let's take a look at that idea of lending and borrowing and the redistribution that happens with inflation being different than expected. So the interest rate, quick little refresher, is basically what you pay, the price that you pay to borrow somebody's money, right? So there's a nominal interest rate and there's a real interest rate. The nominal interest rate is the rate that you pay to the bank, the one that's stated on, on the contract. So if I go to buy a new car and I get a 5% interest rate, that's the nominal interest rate. But if during the period when I'm borrowing that money, I'm using that money and I have not yet paid it back to the bank, if inflation is 2%, it's quickly clear that that bank is not actually going to see 5% back. It's going to see 5% less inflation, less that 2% inflation, and the remainder is their real interest rate. And so the bank is expecting, under current conditions, to receive a 3% real interest rate. Now, if inflation is higher than 2%, it's clear that the bank will see less than 3% real return. And equally, it's clear that the borrower, will pay less than 3% real interest rate on that money. So if the inflation rate is higher than everybody expects, the lenders lose and the borrowers gain, and vice versa. Here's a little bit of a practice to get you thinking about this. And a little historical example here. In the 70s, remember we looked at that graph where we saw inflation bouncing around quite erratically. We found that people that borrowed money at the beginning of the 70s gained quite a bit because as inflation took off, real interest rates fell dramatically. So here's a multi-step practice problem for you. You're going to need to figure out what the inflation rate is, so you'll take the percent change in the CPI, and then you'll add that to your $30,000 per year base salary, that's a nominal wage rate, and you'll look at your new nominal wage rate, assuming that your salary, your wage, is indexed or tied to the CPI. And here's another practice question, just getting you comfortable calculating inflation. So if you were designing the makeup of the CPI and you're trying to figure out what prices really should be considered important when we look at overall inflation for the average person, it's probably going to be not too different than what you see here. Housing and food and transportation are the biggest single chunks. Everything else sort of fills in the cracks, but housing, transportation, and food are the vast majority of your CPI. And that does it for this screencast. The next slide contains all of your answers.